the headlines with Lydia Thorpe rather than the King's face being on the front pages of the papers is not what you would be designing if you were coming up with a PR strategy for a royal visit, and the first royal visit by a king to Australia.
It was an event that clearly proved to be controversial. Premiers from Australian states turned down an invitation to arrive. The royals were, we're hearing, quote, unruffled, and their tour continues. Sarah Hewson, the royal correspondent, is here. Sarah, good morning.
Morning to you, Rosie.
How prepared were the palace for an event like what happened yesterday?
Well, look, there were a number of factors to consider ahead of this tour of Australia, notably the King's health challenges, whether that would be an impact, also Republican sentiment in Australia. But the rights of Indigenous people is a conversation that has been going on for a long time now in Australia, and particularly fervently in the last year or so since the Voice referendum, which was a referendum on giving Indigenous people greater access to government, was rejected. And so that should always have been a factor here. Those planning the visit and the events yesterday in Canberra were well aware of Lydia Thorpe's reputation. This is by no means her first such protests, but a decision was made that it would have been wrong and worse to exclude her from the event as an elected senator. So it should have been factored in. I think there was shock and surprise in the room when she launched her protest, although, as you say, the King and Queen themselves appeared unfazed and turned to talk to the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and his partner. The King has long and strong bonds with Aboriginal communities in Australia. It's something he's been talking about for a long time. Indeed, he started his address yesterday by acknowledging those who had originally owned this land and had cared for it for 65,000 years, he said. And sprinkled throughout the programme of this tour are meetings with Aboriginal elders and First Nations communities, including today, where he's been visiting an Aboriginal centre in Sydney, and the elder Alan Murray, Uncle Alan Murray, who was welcoming him, says we have a story to tell, and you witnessed that story in Canberra yesterday. So it is certainly a conversation that is happening loud in Australia at the moment, and the King certainly heard that message loud and clear yesterday and will continue to be having those conversations. The general feeling appears to be that this was not the time and the place, and that it was a disrespectful protest. If you look at some of the headlines on the Australian newspapers today, The Australian, a royal pain in the house with a photograph of Lydia Thorpe. The Daily Telegraph, raging Thorpe, a royal nuisance. The PM, Anthony Albanese, dismissing it as disrespectful. But King Charles, I think, today will have been at pains as he visited that centre to hear the words and thoughts of those First Nation communities and the elders that he is meeting.
Yeah, do you think it was maybe a misstep in just the planning of the tour, that today he's been at the Australian National Centre of Indigenous Excellence? Would it have helped if that came further up the agenda, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Rosie. If this had been first on the agenda and the King had been able to acknowledge the significance and importance of the Indigenous peoples of Australia first, then perhaps this protest would have had some of its stuffing knocked out of it. Although, as I said, the King certainly did acknowledge that in his speech yesterday at Parliament in Canberra. I think it would, though, as you say, have been better if this had come further up the agenda rather than on the final day in Sydney.
Yeah. Do you think it's overshadowed the trip? I think the palace may fear that the thing that this trip will be remembered for will be what happened yesterday.
Yeah, and the optics of it aren't great, are they? Yesterday, they wanted to be talking about the King in Canberra. He was visiting the National Botanical Gardens with really important discussions about climate change. They would have wanted that to be the headlines and the talking points, certainly not this protest. But the King doesn't shy away from these kind of conversations. We know that he'd engaged in letters with Republican leaders and those behind the Republican movement in Australia. And as I said, he has been long having conversations about the rights of Indigenous people. So it's certainly not something that he wants to see quietened or muffled in any way. But the headlines with Lidia Thorpe rather than the King's face being on the front pages of the papers is not what you would be designing if you were coming up with a PR strategy for a royal visit and the first royal visit by a king to Australia.
I know, particularly with the conversations Australia are having around, holding a referendum on becoming a republic. Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah Hewson, the royal correspondent. And Sarah mentions the front pages. Well, the Daily Telegraph has got, it says, backlash at a senator who swore at the king. And there's a photograph of Lidia Thorpe, who'd been shouting things that are unbroadcastable, I'm afraid, at this time. The Guardian also has a photograph of her, and it isn't, of course, what the palace would want, but, how much would a sort of a better PR job of that tour actually done to change sentiment? I think probably very little.
I really am enormously touched by those very kind welcomes and by your invitation, Prime Minister, to say a few words here in Parliament House, the national home of Australia's strong and vibrant democratic tradition. Let me also say how deeply I appreciated this morning's moving Welcome to Country ceremony, which offers me the opportunity to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people and all First Nations peoples who have loved and cared for this continent for 65,000 years.
You're going to have to pull out. Just put your thumbs down, enjoy the moment.